So I'm a disease ecologist and quantitative ecologist in wild. And I think most of you think of me mostly as working on bighorn sheep because I'm like this highly system-specific person. But I was trained in an infectious disease dynamics center where I was the only person who worked on wildlife. And everyone else worked on measles and malaria and herpes simplex and pertussis in human systems. And so I have some versatility across the human and wildlife interface. And so I figured I could get people to show up if I gave a talk on coronavirus, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to try and kind of draw on some general themes from disease ecology to try and lend some insight into what's going on with the coronavirus, to try and anchor the coronavirus in some of these theoretical constructs. And so I'm going to start just by talking about how we think about the biological process beneath an epidemic. Then I'll talk a little bit about transmission and its relevant components. I'll talk about two threshold quantities that are relevant, I think, in this system right now. And then hopefully I will get done quickly because I'm, anxious and keyed up as usual, and then we'll be able to talk about things. Okay. But this didn't fit anywhere else, so I'm going to put it in here. So there's been a lot of discussion of the case fatality rate associated with this coronavirus. And I think many of you have probably seen this, but I just want to re-articulate it for those of you who have not. In my opinion, the best estimates that we have right now come from a study of the first 72,000 cases in Wuhan. And that came out, this is a little bit old now, this came out like February 11th. And there are a few kind of broad themes that I think we can take from that study. One is that mortality clearly appears to be age-structured, and it hits oldest people the hardest, right? It definitely seems to be quite high in clinically severe cases. So of people who had clinically severe cases, they estimated a 49% case fatality rate. It's pretty bad. And then it definitely seemed to vary depending on context. Why that variation exists, kind of remains to be seen. There are, several different ways in which these estimates could be bad. It is reasonable to think that their estimates, which they estimated an aggregate case fatality rate of 2.4% in Wuhan, and they estimated 0.4% outside of Wuhan. Those could be low, and the reason that they're low is if you just take the number of deaths that you've seen today and divide it by your number of infections today, you haven't allowed for all of those infections to progress far enough to die. And so their denominator might be biased a little bit low, which would make their estimates a little bit low. On the other hand, they could be too high, and the reason that they could be too high is that we right now have very limited information on how many infections are actually out there. And I think everyone's heard about this, and this is why the estimates are bouncing all over the place. We might know what this actually is in a couple years, but we're not going to know it for a while. And so I think folks who are focused on treatment and management in real time are not too worried about this estimate. They're trying to deal with the cases in front of them. And for the rest of us, this is just going to keep evolving. And I would not invest too much in any of these estimates at this point in time. Okay, so back to what I was actually going to talk about. So when we think about the biological process surrounding an epidemic, there are kind of two different fields of ecological thought that we draw from. One is the kind of typical interaction between consumers and produce, and then you've got lots of reproduction going on in your resource, lots of mortality happening in the consumer, and this is kind of our typical motif. That plays out in the context of disease as well. Here, though, our consumer is the pathogen. So we've got the consumer, it hits the resource, which is, I forgot to delete my extra circles. It hits the resource, which is the host, changes the host from being a resource to being like a consumer, right? And then that now consumed host can produce more infections out in the world. So we kind of have this same basic pattern from predator-prey dynamics playing out in disease as well. The kind of other school of ecological thought that is useful when you think about epidemics is to think about landscapes and patches. And so we can think about, kind of a patchy landscape where you've got one occupied patch and everybody else is empty. And from your occupied patch, you maybe have colonization elsewhere out in the landscape and possibly local degradation. So that one time step forward, your original occupied patch is no longer available, and you've got occupation of new parts of the landscape, right? You can think about the same sort of thing operating with a bunch of hosts and a pathogen, where if you start off with everybody being susceptible, and throughout here I will use blue for susceptible, red for infected, and green for recovered. I'm sorry for red-green colorblind people, but these are the colors everybody uses.
What about dead?
We just ignore dead. They go away. In this system, that's fair, right? We don't have any relevant postmortem transmission that we know about. In 2014 Ebola, we really needed to deal with that on its own. So if you get your one infected in here, they can pass on their infection to new patches, new individuals in the system. Maybe everybody eventually gets infected, and then this guy recovers. And being recovered, if you become immune to a pathogen, then you are no longer a piece of habitat that's available for occupation, right? So you're basically removed from the system. And so we often, in disease ecology, will combine recovered and mortality, dead, into the same group because they are just not there for us. Okay, so if we kind of resolve ourselves to a biological process of an epidemic, we can think of our susceptible individual encountering some infected, transitioning to becoming infected themselves, and then eventually recovering. And this is kind of the standard disease ecology model. We refer to this as an SIR model, and it comes up all the time. It's like the Lotka-Volterra of disease ecology. And if we think about how that dynamic should play out at a population level when you have a new pathogen come into a system, as occurred in this case, right? So initially, nobody's seen the pathogen. Everybody should be susceptible. And so you start off with 100% of your population in the blue group, in the susceptible group, and just a few down in your infected group. As the epidemic progresses forward, you initially see exponential growth of the infected group. So you initially see very rapid growth of the infection compartment. That eventually will subside as the infecteds become recovered. So you can see the green line beginning to take off. And then eventually, the system will resolve itself with everyone being in the recovered category. This is if you don't have any births, deaths. It's just kind of a very closed system. So to kind of recapitulate some of this, we see this nearly exponential growth right after invasion, and then at the end, everybody's in this recovered group. And this red line gets referred to, so that is your number of infecteds through time, that gets referred to as the epidemic curve, and that's something that's now being referenced a little bit in the media. So if we're going to think about a reasonable state space for a pathogen like the Wuhan coronavirus, the disease ecologists tend to start with this SIR framework and then deviate from there as needed. This kind of structure works really well. SIR models work very well for childhood infections, morbillivirus infections like canine distemper, but they don't work that well all the time. And in fact, epidemics where you wind up with everyone eventually landing in recovered and having recovered be really stable are relatively rare. So another motif that you see fairly often is where individuals just become infected and then they're there forever. So that would be like your chronic wasting disease kind of situation, or HIV, where you acquire an infection and then it is lifelong. What I think is maybe one of the more common motifs of disease dynamic that we see is something kind of in between, where you have individuals who are infected, and then they can go into kind of a latent class. And then out of that latent state, they can either return to be infected, or maybe their immunity to the pathogen wanes and they become susceptible again. right? So if we were talking about like seasonal influenza, for example, you might move through this progression and eventually land in the latent state, but then that immunity is not going to be very effective in the future, so you'll eventually wane back to being susceptible. And this kind of motif is pretty common and has some features that are not particularly useful. I think herpes simplex virus is maybe like a really good example of a disease that works this way, where you're infected, and then you're latently infected, and your infection can flare back up. That's a fairly common structure. If we have a situation where we have either vectors or multiple relevant hosts, the whole thing becomes way more complicated. So this would be like a very simple toy model of malaria where you've got to deal with dynamics in the mosquito and dynamics in the human, and those are interacting with one another. Fortunately, that's not the situation here. We've basically had spillover into humans, no additional relevant transmission from the reservoir population that we've been able to detect, and there's no vectoring. So we are in a relatively simple situation here. So to kind of tie this into the coronavirus context, so this is, stole this from the New York Times today. So this is kind of the epidemic curve, if you will, of the Wuhan coronavirus. So the yellow bit, that's the current cases, that's like the red eye line in the SIR plot. And a couple of relevant points here. First, we have this rapid exponential growth at the beginning, or just sub-exponential growth at the beginning. That's what we're seeing right now in the United States, right? And that's why people are freaking out when they weren't freaking out a week ago. And then I imagine most of you are now familiar with what this jump is, right? So there was a change in case definition, which meant that a lot of people that had previously not been classified as infected were all called infected on the same day. And then we've got this group of recovereds up here. These individuals are clinically recovered, which means that they have resolved the pathology associated with the disease. I don't think that we know definitively whether they have actually cleared the pathogen. We just know that they've become healthy again. And this is a big knowledge gap for us right now. Okay, so this is just kind of a different representation of the same time series. This is from a JAMA paper. And this is population-level aggregated data. So you can see the number of new cases at onset and then at diagnosis as two different time series here. And the one thing that I want to point out is this period of time where they begin to get into the like exponential growth phase that we can see easily on this, this particular version of the axis. This date right here is when they really began to clamp down on movement within Wuhan. So it took quite a while. There was quite a lag in the system in order for their case counts to actually come down. So here they kind of map out all the management that was happening throughout that period of time. Yeah, let's see. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. So those data were all just kind of population level aggregate data. There have been a couple of case studies of particular individuals, groups of individuals who are getting sampled longitudinally, which is to say you go back to the same individual over and over again and retest them. We've gotten a couple of useful and kind of disturbing bits of information out of that. One is this result where they've been testing individuals for the pathogen, and they test them twice over 24 hours, and then people are typically released from quarantine or the hospital if they test negative twice over 24 hours. There have been a number of instances now where people fulfilled that criterion. They tested negative a couple of times in a row, they were released from quarantine, and then they tested positive again. So we don't really know, I think right now, we don't know how frequently that happens. We don't know what grade of infection those individuals have, whether they are transmitting effectively or not. But I think this is a case study of like 5 people. Like there's not much replication here right now. But this is potentially disconcerting. We don't really know that people actually clear their infections fully and become recovered. And this is potentially problematic. And then we've also seen transmission from asymptomatic individuals. And, you know, people have been talking a ton about this, but I think it's this case study that kind of kicked that off. So this is a family that live outside of Wuhan. There was a woman in the family who'd been in Wuhan. She came home. She tested negative on PCR here, and then tested positive going forward, but never showed any symptoms. But then if you look at her family members, they all showed symptoms and then tested consistently positive. And she was their only connection to the virus, so she must have transmitted it. We don't have PCR data, which is to say diagnostic data associated with her prior to this date, but it's pretty clear, just given the epidemiological context, that she must have been transmitting. She was the only way they could have gotten it. And so, in both of these cases, these are important insights that tell us about the disease dynamics, but they rely on these longitudinal data without a ton of replication just yet. And those are data sets that should be expanding quickly. We should be learning more about these elements of the disease process going forward, but right now, they're kind of important to our assumptions. Okay, so if we wanted to think about a plausible process here for how this virus is operating, we can think about individuals who are susceptible. They seem to become exposed and incubate for a while, and this coronavirus is consistent, it seems, with like the common cold coronaviruses, which are a little slower than a rhinovirus. So it's about a 2 to 3 week incubation period typically before people start showing symptoms. So that duration is maybe fairly relevant. Then we've got these infected individuals who become clearly infected and we can see their symptoms. And then we've got these latently infected individuals who seem to be asymptomatically transmitting. And some of these infecteds are subject to disease-induced mortality, but again, like we can't really estimate how large that compartment is. And then we don't know what happens. Maybe they recover, and I think it's reasonable to initially assume that they do recover fully and probably are protected from the pathogen, and probably these cases of recrudescent shedding are rare, but this is not something we know yet, I would say. And just to kind of clarify how we're categorizing people into these compartments, we're calling an S anybody who hasn't been infected yet, right? So anybody not in one of the other compartments, so almost everyone. E, I think, is not really something we can know right now, but we're kind of assuming that anyone who's been in contact with an infected individual is probably in the exposed state right now, and that's a very conservative assumption, but one we should make from a management stance. Our I's right now, those are our cases, right? So these are, and cases are clinical infections, right? People we actually detect who are infected. And they are diagnosed either on the basis of clinical signs or, maybe one day on the basis of diagnostic tests. But most of those cases are determined on the basis of clinical signs right now. And then we've got our L's, who are positive on the diagnostic test without clinical signs. And we're not testing people without clinical signs, so we don't really know how big this group is. And then our R's are these clinically recovered and hopefully PCR negative, which is to say we can't get the pathogen out of them, individuals, right? So this is maybe the structure we're working with. Just a couple comments on those designations. So ideally, we would identify susceptible individuals and recovered individuals on the basis of an antibody test, which is a test that looks at whether you have exhibited an immune response to a given organism. Right, so if you have no antibody response to the pathogen, you haven't seen it, we take you to be susceptible if you're not currently infected. And if you have antibodies to the pathogen, we want to assume that you're not going to get it again, that they're effective and you're recovered. And ideally, the exposed, the active infections, serious infections, and the latent infections would all be identified on the basis of a PCR test where you actually detect the genetic material of the pathogen in the host. Right now, that's not how these tests are working, right? That's not how we're making these categorizations now, but that's what we would ideally want. And in a well-studied system, one where we have tests that work well, that are well-developed, this is what we operate with. Right? It is not on the basis of clinical diagnosis, of clinical signs. It's on the basis of these formal diagnostic tests. How am I doing? Are you guys bored? No? Good. You've all had So you know the answer to that question. Okay, so a couple of gradations from this model that we might consider is some kind of a continuum from these really severe infections to the totally latent ones, where you kind of have a gradient in your disease-induced mortality rate that's associated with the severity of the clinical signs. This is a pain in the butt to model, so we don't usually model things this way, but we could think about doing it this way. Just to provide a little evidence for why we maybe should think about the system as being gradiated from seriously infected to kind of these latent infections, is that in the early studies, we've seen these huge differences in case fatality rates among different age groups. And this made my mom feel better, so I'm telling everyone this now. In the 72,000 cases out of Wuhan, the first 72,000, they had this fairly high disease-induced mortality rate. Those mortalities are very highly concentrated in people over 80, and my mom is under 80, so she was very happy about that. And even in the 70 group, you have a pretty high case fatality rate. It's much, much lower as you move down in age, and really there's virtually very little evidence of disease-induced mortality in kids. So people under 20 don't really seem to be hit by this in the same way. And then just a little bit more on the R state. This is the mathiest I'm going to get. So in our kind of classic system here where we don't have any births or deaths, it's just like a really fast epidemic sweeping through a system, everybody gets absorbed into the recovered state immediately. So once you get into the recovered class, you can't get out of it. You're recovered for life. This is like how measles operates. Once you've had that vaccine or actually seen the pathogen, you're immune for life. And so you can't get out of that state. And I just have this here because I need it later, so don't worry about it. So if we think about how individuals are transitioning among the states, I'm showing you where they're landing here in the columns. And in the rows, if we've got our susceptibles here, susceptibles move out of the susceptible state at this infection rate. They move into the I state, and they can't get directly to R, right? So you have to go through I to get to R. If you're in I, you can't go back to S. You never get to go to S, right? But you can leave I either by dying, which is alpha, so our disease-induced mortality rate is alpha here, or by recovering, which is gamma. So you can get out of I and move into R through recovery. And then the last option is R, and for R, you can't get from R to S, and you can't get from R to I. If you're in R, you're stuck in R. You're always going to go back to R. As soon as you put births and deaths into the system, so any demographic turnover, you change this. So if we put in some demographic turnover, we have new susceptibles being born into the system, then we wind up with, you've got R's producing new S's, everybody's producing new S's, and this like stuttering stream of S's might be enough to keep your pathogen going, right? So once you have demography operating in a system, you're letting people born and die out, then you can wind up with R no longer being an absorbing state. You can kind of keep the infection fed through these newborns. Right, so then you've got R no longer absorbing, and that means the pathogen can persist. Okay, so in the first case, the pathogen doesn't persist. You sweep through the whole system, everybody sees the pathogen, everybody gets exposed to the pathogen, everybody recovers from the pathogen has destroyed all of its habitat patches, and it goes extinct. In this case, if you have new habitat patches being born, then the pathogen might be able to kind of move forward through time. So in this case, it's relevant to think about whether R is absorbing. So we've got some natural bursts, refilling S here. We might have some waning immunity, which is to say you're really immune right after you clear the pathogen, but then the pathogen's going to be changing, right? And so if you see a new version of the pathogen 3 weeks later, you might no longer be immune to this newly evolved version. And then lastly, we've got these clinically recovered individuals that we're calling recovered, but they may still be carrying the bug, and we just don't know. And so just, to kind of put a fine point on what I'm trying to say here, because I was not explicit because I made these slides really fast. There's not, I don't think, a great reason to expect this thing necessarily to circle the world and fade out. I'm not, there are reasons to think that that should happen. I don't want to say that that's not what's going to happen, but I don't think that we should necessarily expect it to sweep through everyone and go away, because we have mechanisms by which it could persist, right? We have turnover in our populations. It evolves quickly. We may not have stable immunity to it, and then we don't actually know. Maybe people are infected for much longer than we expect. That's not to say that that's what's going to happen, but it's worth considering that possibility. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about transmission and how it operates here. So if we're kind of thinking about our simple system of the disease, the transmission piece is how you get from susceptible to exposed. So it's what's happening that makes you exposed. That's the critical element. And so we're kind of addressing how S's become E's here. And this is going to depend on the ratio of S's to I's within your population. So if you have just one S and a ton of I's, then that S is going to encounter I's almost certainly and get infected. It's also going to depend on your overall population level contact rate. So that's just like, how extensively are we mixing? And that is the thing we're managing for like crazy right now, right? They're trying to cut down on population level mixing. And then lastly, the probability of transmission given contact. So given that I'm susceptible and come in contact with an infected individual, what is the probability I actually acquire the pathogen? We're also managing for that. So just kind of some basic insights on these. As the population converts out of S, so right now we're like almost all in S, right? As we begin to convert from S into some of these other states, that should slow the transmission rate down a little bit. It should be really fast right now. These contact rates are going to be dynamic, right? So we're managing to change them very actively, but then also the pathogen is trying to find new ways to circumvent our management strategies, right? It's the more we try to mitigate contact, the more it is going to be under selective pressure to find more reliable ways to transmit, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but respiratory droplets work really well if you're in like a dense and well-mixed population, but if individuals won't come near each other, you're much better off being vertically transmitted from mother to offspring or being a sexually transmitted bug. And then lastly, the probability of transmission given contact. This is going to vary depending on how effectively the infected host is shedding. And so if we're going to assume that most transmission for the coronavirus is respiratory droplet based, as soon as you're coughing, you're facilitating that transmission, right? So coughing individuals should be exuding a much higher dose on individuals that they encounter than asymptomatic individuals. I can't quite understand how the transmission prior to symptoms is working in this system, and no one's been able to explain it to me yet. So it seems like, in this case, symptoms should facilitate transmission. Remains to be seen, I think. Okay, so just to kind of lay these things out a little more clearly, if you think about the ratio of S's to I's in your population, if everybody gets 3 contacts, then your one infected individual here, they're going to get to generate 3 new infections, right? If you're in a case like this where everyone is infected, then your infecteds are contacting each other, so they don't get to make any new cases, right? Because anybody they encounter is already infected. And so, because you just got these eyes contacting one another. And then the last case is one that we haven't heard about much yet in this context, but it's going to come up sooner, I think. And that's the case where you've got a bunch of recovereds in your population, and your recovereds buffer contacts between susceptibles and infecteds. So if you're infected and everybody that you contact is recovered, you don't get to transmit. You have to reach the susceptible. And so this kind of buffering is referred to as herd immunity. right? So herd immunity is when you have such a high proportion of your population recovered that you can no longer effectively connect infected and susceptible individuals to generate new infections. Okay, let's see. So in this case, we've got the epidemic slowing as the pathogen runs out of S's, and we can kind of see that here, right? So in the Wuhan example, where they were really effective about clamping down on things, we begin to see the number of cases subside, right? But then we've got this global growth, which becomes problematic. Okay. If we think about the overall population level contact rate, there are kind of two different extremes in which we think about how contact rate relates to population density. So in one case, we've got per capita contact rates declining as population density comes down. This is what should happen for a respiratory droplet-borne pathogen. Your number of potential contacts comes down as we thin the population out, right? So this is referred to as density-dependent transmission. There are other forms of transmission where even as population density comes down, your number of potential infected contacts remains the same. And that happens in situations where you've got highly conserved routes of transmission. It's referred to as frequency-dependent transmission. And kind of the canonical cases for pathogens that we expect to exhibit density-dependent transmission are these aerosols, respiratory droplets, or fomite-driven pathogens. So like this, we should be in a density-dependent situation. If you're in a frequency-dependent situation, the canonical case that we think of are STDs, where even as population density gets very low, individuals have roughly the same number of sexual contacts. But we might also expect something like this to happen, right? Where as the population density comes down, we eventually see the transmission rate level off. And this would happen if the pathogen can find a new way to transmit, right? So it's going to be under a lot of selective pressure to switch to frequency-dependent modes of transmission as we limit contacts. Whether it can do that remains to be seen. But Ebola did, right? So in 2014 Ebola, we had this big outbreak, right? The initial mode of transmission was largely through bodily fluids. And then as the epidemic wore onward and we wound up with more and more cases, the pathogen came up with some new, I say that loosely, came up with some new places it could hide, right? So there were a bunch of stories at that time about this guy who'd been, he got Ebola, he was a doctor, and his eye color changed after he had Ebola, and then they sampled his eyeball, and he had Ebola living in his eye, because the eye is an immune-privileged site. So you guys did not know this. I'm getting shocked faces. Oh, you missed this story. It was a good story. So the pathogen, if it can figure out how to get itself into an immune-privileged site where it's not going to be subject to aggressive attack from the immune system, it may find new ways to hide out. And so there was a lot of discussion about, well, can Ebola transmit through tears? Does not seem that it could. But there were, towards the end, a number of documented cases of sexual transmission of Ebola as well. So the reproductive tract is also immune privileged, right? So the pathogen, when you've got this huge population growth of the pathogen, it's got a lot of evolutionary space to operate in, and we should expect it to potentially come up with some new places, new strategies for getting through and propagating through the population. Oh, I told you one new exciting thing. And then the probability of transmission given contact. So I think this probably should vary with symptoms. That's usually how respiratory droplet diseases work. We maybe should also expect some gradation in susceptibility, right? So right now we're regarding all susceptibles as susceptible. I'm as susceptible as my mom, and I'm susceptible as my newborn niece, right? we're all the same. There's reasonable data to think that suggests that this is not the case. So in particular, there was, at least early on, a disproportionately low number of cases among kids. So it just wasn't showing up in kids. And the thinking there was that kids have probably been exposed to our 4 kind of normally circulating coronaviruses recently, and probably may have some effective cross-strain immunity that is protecting them from infection. And then I think there's some reason to think that there may be more susceptibility, and this is probably true in folks who are immunocompromised. So a small infecting dose may be able to start infections in them than in someone who is in good health. But we haven't dealt with that too much yet. So if we just kind of want to think about, how these different drivers of transmission can map onto management, if we're thinking about the ratio of S's to I's in a population, when you vaccinate, well, let's see, maybe you guys know. What does a vaccine do to your SIR progression? Right, they skip, right? We shunt individuals, artificially from S into R, and they just skip over I, right? And so by doing that, we're kind of buffering, we're allowing the population to buffer against contacts between susceptible and infected individuals. I'm not optimistic about vaccination in this case, but I don't work on vaccine development, and they're smarter than me, so. If we want to think about overall population-level contact rates, the easiest way to deal with this is to isolate. And so if we're in a density-dependent type situation, as we certainly appear to be right now, if you can get people to isolate, basically what you're doing is dropping down the per capita contact rate, right? So you're kind of shifting the system down to a slightly slower trajectory. And then if we think about manipulating the probability of transmission given contact, so this is treating people or getting people with symptoms to self-isolate. If we assume that symptoms facilitate transmission, then what would happen if we can reduce the probability of transmission given contact is that we basically shift down these per capita, potential infectious contact rates in no matter what form of mixing the population exhibits. Okay, I'm going really fast because I'm like right on time here. This is great. So the last thing I want to do is talk about a couple of different threshold quantities in disease ecology and when to use them. So this is the bit about R0, which is like obligatory. So disease ecologists tend to think about 2 important thresholds that govern epidemiological dynamics. The first one is the invasion threshold, and it basically is the number of new cases you get from your first case if everybody's susceptible. So if you put a measles case into a population where everybody is susceptible to measles, you will expect to get 18 new cases. It's kind of the benchmark example. That quantity is referred to as R0, and people are talking, it's showing up in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and other places I didn't expect it. So R0, loosely, and the particular structure of R0 depends on your disease process model. So this is a way to think about it, but this is not exactly the formulation you'd use in this particular context. But it is approximately the transmission rate over the recovery rate. So how quickly do you create new cases versus how quickly do you stop being a case? It's the ratio of those 2. If that thing's over 1, then you're creating cases faster than you're losing cases and your epidemic's growing. If it's less than 1, then you're losing cases faster than you're creating them and your epidemic's going to decline. So it gets used as a modulator for whether a pathogen can invade a population and have an epidemic or it can't really get started. This, in my mind, is irrelevant now for this situation. This thing can clearly get into a population and start an epidemic. Right? It did that. Let's see, so just to kind of give you a sense of the kind of space of R0 values that are out there, measles right now is the highest estimated R0 that people typically talk about, and it gets estimated on the order of 12 to 18. Those are old estimates because we do not have populations that are fully susceptible to measles any longer, right? And then there are a bunch of different examples in here that may be of interest to you, but I copied this from Wiki so you can look it up. One caveat with R0 that is really relevant here is that there is no inherent timescale to R0. It is just the ratio of how many cases you create or how quickly you create cases to how quickly you lose cases. So you can have a pathogen like HIV/AIDS, which has an R0, on the order of 4, and contrast that with 2014 Ebola, where R0 was on the order of 2. And so the R0 for HIV is much higher, but the rate at which we accumulated HIV cases was much slower than the rate at which we accumulated cases for Ebola. And so, from a theoretical stance, that's not super important, but it matters a lot when the critical determinant of the case fatality rate is access to intensive care units, right? So we're trying to dodge a resource limitation in this context and slow down the epidemic growth rate, right? So I feel like the epidemic growth rate is more useful here. How quickly we're getting new cases, I think, is more useful than R0 as a pragmatic, management-oriented estimate right now. Okay. And then the other threshold, which gets discussed less frequently, but I think is going to be pretty relevant here, is the persistence threshold, or the critical community size. And so this is after a pathogen has invaded. The question that is posed by this threshold is, can it persist? Do you have enough hosts and enough turnover in susceptible hosts to allow the pathogen to persist for the long term? And so this is not well estimated in very many cases. But so yeah, it's the minimum population size within which the pathogen can persist just on human-to-human transmission. For measles, the estimates on the critical community size are typically somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 people. And that is tied very tightly to the birth rate in that system. But mostly the thing to think about is how quickly you're refilling S's. So for example, for flu, where your immunity wanes very quickly relative to the change in the virus, the critical community size could be quite small because individuals are losing their immunity, they're waning back into S. And so the pathogen has more patches that are being rejuvenated that it can live on. Yeah, could be pretty low for the coronavirus, I think. And I think maybe we should expect it to keep circulating. It should be under a lot of selective pressure to become less virulent, make us less sick, but I don't think it's going to be under much selective pressure to go away. Right. Okay, so I'm going to be right on time. Sorry for anthropomorphizing. But I wanted to think just at the end a little bit about the coronavirus's sort of goal and how it might achieve the goal. I think this is useful. So its goal, basically, just like all of biology's goal, is to go forth and reproduce, right? It wants to persist. That's what it should want to do, right? In order to do that, there are a few things it needs to avoid doing. It needs to not burn through all of the available habitat. And so there are a few ways it could try to do that. One is to live longer on the patches that it already occupies. So that is generate longer infectious periods, and it could do that pretty well if it could make its host less symptomatic so they don't fight it, or not kill its host so that it, abruptly ends its duration on their island, right? And then also it should be looking for places to hide where it's not going to be combated by the host immune system. The other option is to identify new suites of patches it could live on, some new planets. There's been a lot of talk about this already, but our pets are probably going to get dosed with this in a way that they haven't seen previously, and there are a lot of them out there that it could live on. Coronaviruses aren't great at host switches, so I don't know how much we need to worry about this, but it is a plausible strategy that the virus could adopt. And then the last option is to restore the patches you previously degraded, which is to say change so that you can use new resources from them and their immune system doesn't, work for you anymore. I think we should anticipate that it's going to try to do all of these things, right? It should be under selective pressure to do all of these things. In this particular case, So it's a big RNA virus, but it's an RNA virus, and RNA viruses change quickly. This is also, and if there are virologists in here who know more about this than I do, speak up at some point. But the coronavirus, like influenza, is subject to antigenic shift in addition to antigenic drift. So the antigenic shift thing is like the HN business associated with the flu, where you can get these reconfigurations of H's and N's that determine virulence. Coronavirus can do that same thing. I don't think we necessarily know what proteins we should be worried about. We don't have labels for things like H's and N's yet, but it can do this kind of abrupt shift in evolutionary space, and I think we should expect it to potentially do that. Okay. And then the other thing that the pathogen's going to be under some selective pressure to do is to maintain its ability to get from one patch to another. And so here, if it isn't riding on, or if it's riding on symptoms, it needs to keep making us sick enough to transmit, right? So if it's not riding on symptoms, and by riding on symptoms, I mean capitalizing on making its host cough to get from one host to another. If it's riding on those symptoms, it has to keep making us somewhat sick, because that's how it gets from host to host. If it can come up with some other way to transmit that doesn't make us sick, then it should be selected to do that, but it's unclear where it will land right now. And then I just kind of want to wrap with this. I think that the best analogy in my mind to this coronavirus is influenzas. I think that's more useful from a scientific stance than thinking of measles or Ebola or other diseases of that ilk as an analog. This is in part because of its capacity to undergo antigenic shift. Apparently, it has a fairly wide host range. I don't think we know a ton about that yet, but it should, there are a lot more coronaviruses out there now who are able to switch hosts, right? Because they were able to do it. There should be some advantage to doing that. So we should maybe anticipate that being an issue. And then we don't really know where co-infections with multiple coronaviruses within a common host are going to take us. So this is, kind of how flu moves, is you get a co-infection within an individual of two different strains of flu, and that allows for the recombination that gets you new configurations of H's and N's. The coronavirus might also be able to do that, and almost certainly we're going to have individuals who are co-infected with multiple coronaviruses, because 30% of our common colds are coronaviruses. So we're going to have individuals who are seeing both in tandem, and I don't think we know how that's going to play out. That's all I had for you today. I will just caveat all of this by saying I really do mostly work on bighorn sheep, and so I kind of am somewhat conversant in this area, but I don't know everything. So if I have said things that are incorrect that you know are wrong, please correct me. Otherwise, I will try and answer your questions. Okay. Yeah.
Kezia, I read today that congressional physician is estimating that 30% of the American population will get this. Do you think that's about right?
Sounds totally plausible to me. But I don't know. I think it depends a lot on how effectively we clamp down. I think that's almost more of a political question or not a political question, but a governmental efficacy question than it is an epidemiological question right now. So if Americans will actually stop moving and sit in their houses for 2 weeks, then I think we should expect to begin to see clearance, but I don't know that anyone knows whether we can do that.
Could you mention in this context the rate of infection with influenza?
Yeah, well, sort of. So this year's flu is pretty bad, right? This is a fairly high virulent flu. The transmission rate for this corona is thought to be somewhat, let's see, am I going to say this right? Because there have been different estimates, right? So there are not estimates on this coronavirus from 1.4 to 6.7 that I've seen. Your typical seasonal flu is around 1.4-ish, so it seems to be slightly more transmissible than seasonal flu. However,
So number
That is the number of new cases you expect to get from one case in an otherwise fully susceptible population. So it is the super jargony thing. Let's see. Oh yeah, so a couple things that make this very different than flu. So most flu transmission occurs after onset of symptoms, and it's not clear that that's the case for this coronavirus. That makes it much harder for people to effectively self-isolate and should allow that reproductive rate to stay high in the virus. Certainly right now it looks like the case fatality rate is higher than seasonal flu, but how much higher I don't think we know. Right. But that's not quite your question.
How many people would get this?
Yeah.
Saying symptomatic and asymptomatic, and for the common flu.
Oh, okay. This is what you want is common flu. Yeah. So the common flu asymptomatic. Yep. Mm-hmm, yep. Yeah. So for your standard influenza, about 75% of hosts are thought to be asymptomatically infected. For this coronavirus, it's thought that about 81% of individuals are in the low symptom category, but low symptom gets defined different ways in different papers. There doesn't seem to be agreement there. So it does seem to be that there's some consolidation now, at least in who's getting diagnostic tests, of you have to have a fever and upper respiratory tract infection symptoms. However, I don't think we should necessarily think that both of those are necessary in order to indicate an infection, just is the criterion for diagnostic testing now. Julie?
So several countries have now put bans on wildlife trade. How does that play into all of these models and estimates?
So I think in this case that is, I don't think that is going to be relevant for this outbreak at all. I think that we have had the spillover event. It may have been just a single event. It does not appear that there are new cases arising out of non-human hosts. And so it seems that this was a, kind of one and done sort of phenomenon. However, by putting bans on wildlife trade, you potentially can reduce the likelihood of something like this happening again in the future. And that is, in my mind, that is the entire utility of those bans, and people are capitalizing on a time when people are in a headspace to make change to try and implement those changes now. Yeah.
So you mentioned as the epidemic progresses, we're going to get a lot more data and learn a lot more things. But do you have any insight into how we're going to make sense of all that data, given that different states and different countries are using different diagnostic testing?
Yeah, so this is where, this is like the playground of your heavy-duty empiricists, right, who are dealing with these dynamic process models with measurements that emerge via 5 different tests, all intended to target the same metric. And so, there already has been some effort to, implement, integrated modeling where you're, coalescing a bunch of different data types toward estimation of common parameters for dynamical systems like this one, not just linear models, but also these nonlinear ones. This should push that pretty hard. We'd kind of been futzing around the edges on it, and I hadn't really seen, people haven't pursued it as aggressively as they might, and I think that there's going to be a shift in emphasis there. So maybe think about that for postdoc. Yeah. Do other people have questions besides Tal? Johan.
Okay, so in China now there's a decline in new cases, it seems. But that's because of self-isolation and quarantining, and so the disease is just not spreading, but there's still susceptibles there.
Oh, yes.
So that means that the disease can come back.
Yes.
Whereas in the case of SARS, the disease infected a lot of people and then died out because of herd immunity. And so wouldn't it be a strategy for everybody to just get sick?
Right.
All that herd immunity, and then it's done.
Well, so I think that SARS died out because, so SARS was quite nosocomial in its transmission, right? So SARS and MERS both were harder to transmit than this is, and most of the transmission was nosocomial, which means it happened in a hospital setting between patients and healthcare workers, and then healthcare workers back to other patients. And they were able to achieve herd immunity there in that context because the herd was much smaller. They had these hospital setting herds that could get, they could isolate every last case. I think that, so let's see, but now I've lost what your actual question was.
What I'm getting at is that we can all isolate.
Oh, yes.
The infection rate could drop. We think it's all fine. Start business as usual.
Yes. Oh, for sure. I think that's very likely to happen. And so is it a good strategy to try and get it now? Like, I almost feel like it's a good strategy for, people, like everybody's kids should get it now because they don't seem to get sick from it, right? So people who are likely to be able to combat it well, maybe we should be trying to get it. But, because that would facilitate herd immunity, I think that we don't know well enough who is and is not immunocompromised. And there does seem, right? And I'm not really going to, I hope this is not going to be broadcast anywhere where people I think there's probably likely to be some dose-response relationship here too, where these healthcare workers who are, there were healthcare workers in their 30s, quite a number of them, who have died, right? But they're getting challenged with really high doses. And I don't quite know how we flatten that dose-response curve if we're going to blow up the epidemic writ large across all of our pretty healthy hosts in tandem. It's a thing that one could do in a model, but maybe not in the world. Yeah, Scott.
Why is there a typical flu season that ends, and does it seem like there will be a seasonality for this?
Yeah, well, so there is actually a paper that looks at the epidemic growth rate by the median temperature of the city during the period for this coronavirus, and they can see sort of some temperature-associated dynamics. I think that seasonality, so there are a couple of elements associated with seasonality and influenza. One is seasonality of our waterfowl populations, where typically where our new strains are rising. So waterfowl get, they come to their breeding grounds with really, really low influenza prevalence. They have big epidemics over summer. They have lots of strain recombination, and then you can get transmission onward out of there. I don't think we have an analog to waterfowl, and that if we have an analog, it's bats, and I worked with a bat expert for years, and I have no intuition about how that would work in bats. So humans have seasonality, right? So we typically are not in as close contact with one another in the summer. I think it's reasonable to expect things to come down a little bit and then resurge just because of that alone. But, beyond that, I wouldn't want to hazard it much. And I don't think we should expect it to be as strong as influenza, but only because I feel that making that assumption puts us in a more vulnerable management place. Yeah. Okay, you all have to catch the bus, right? If you have more questions, you can email me and I'll make things up.